16-year-old Deveney Nel should have gone home after a school sports day. That is where this story starts, and where for her family it will forever be stuck in time. A weekday afternoon in August, a school uniform, a high school campus in Caledon that was meant to be safe. She never made it back to her mother. She never walked through the front door. Somewhere between the netball courts and the parking lot, her path crossed with a boy she knew, a fellow learner, someone entrusted with the role of keeping others alive as part of the school's first aid team. Instead, he became the last person to see her alive. Hours later, while her community was searching for her, her body lay hidden in a storeroom on the same school grounds. She'd been throttled and stabbed, her life taken in a space that symbolizes the very opposite of everything that happened to her. A school is supposed to be a refuge, a place of learning, a buffer between children and the dangers of the world. In Deveney's case, it became the crime scene. Her murder did not just shock a small Overberg town. It tore open something much larger and uglier, a pattern of failure that had started long before that afternoon. The teenager who killed her did not emerge from nowhere. His history was not a mystery. In the years before he crossed paths with Deveney on that sports field, he'd been accused of serious offenses, including the assault of another child when he was just 11. Psychologists had warned that he posed a danger. A court had been told that he needed intervention. A magistrate was given the responsibility to act. At every critical moment, the system blinked and looked away. Those omissions did not simply vanish into paperwork. They accumulated and hardened into risk. That risk moved through classrooms, corridors, and sports fields until it arrived in front of Deveney on that cold August day. When we talk about the murder of Deveney Nel, we're not only talking about a single act of violence. We're talking about a chain of decisions and non-decisions that allowed a child with a known violent history to remain in ordinary circulation, unmonitored, untreated, and embedded in the daily life of other children. This is the story about three children: the girl whose life was taken, the girl whose earlier case was mishandled and effectively erased, and the boy placed on a path that turned him into a danger to everyone around him, including himself. It's about what happens when an entire ecosystem, schools, courts, prosecutors, social services, fails to recognize that children can be both vulnerable and dangerous, and that ignoring either side of that reality can end in tragedy. In the days before her death, Overberg High School became a symbol of collective grief. Parents stood at the gate with flowers and candles. Learners struggled to walk past the storeroom block. Teachers tried to return to their classrooms knowing that one of their pupils had killed another only meters away from where they taught them. The town of Caledon, usually mentioned in passing on weather maps and traffic reports, suddenly found itself at the center of a national conversation about youth violence, child-on-child crime, and the collapse of accountability. Across South Africa, people watched this case unfold and saw more than just a headline. They recognized a pattern: dangerous behavior flagged and minimized, psychological warnings filed and ignored, children hurt in private only to be mourned in public when it was too late. In that sense, Deveney's story is not a mystery to be solved, it's an indictment. It forces us to look not only at the boy who wielded the knife, but at the adults and institutions that had second chances to intervene and did not take them. In this episode, we're going to walk through Deveney's short life and the events of the day she died. We will unpack the investigation that followed, the suspect's disturbing past, and the decisions that allowed him to remain in environments where he should never have been unsupervised. We will trace how years of negligence, misjudgment, and administrative convenience culminated in a brutal killing inside a school storeroom. And we will end where the justice system finally did what it should have done years earlier, when the boy responsible stood before a court, not as a misunderstood child in need of help, but as a convicted killer. This is the murder of Deveney Nel. It's a story about a small town's grief, a country's reckoning, and the cost of a justice system that only wakes up when a child is already dead. Before we dive into this gripping narrative, please take a moment to subscribe to our podcast. We'd also appreciate it if you followed our sister podcast, Unsolved Murders SA, where we delve into South Africa's most unsettling cold cases. Please take note, the views, opinions, and information expressed in this series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Swisher Post, its parent company, Our Wish You Would Publications, and its partners. Some of the content featured in the series describes details of extreme violence, therefore, viewers' discretion is strongly advised. Before her name became the center of headlines and court proceedings, Deveney Nel was known simply as a lively, spirited teenager whose presence could brighten a room without effect. At 16, she was at that delicate point in adolescence where the world still felt open, where friendships mattered deeply, and where the rhythms of school, home, and sports shaped her everyday life. People who knew her well remember her laughter first, a sounding, bubbling kind of humor that carried across the open spaces of Overberg High School. It was the sort of laugh that made others laugh with her, even before they knew what the joke was. She grew up in Grabo, commuting to Caledon each day for school, a routine that reflected the importance her family placed on her education. At Overberg High, she was recognized as a dedicated learner, someone who approached her work with the consistency and determination that teachers admired. She wasn't the type to draw attention for the sake of being noticed. Instead, her presence stood out because she was quietly reliable, approachable, and grounded. Sports played a central part in her school identity. She gravitated naturally toward netball, not only because she enjoyed the pace of the game, but because it placed her within a close-knit team environment where she thrived. Beyond playing, she devoted herself to the school's first aid program, a responsibility usually taken up by learners who showed both competence and maturity. It was a role that required trust. Staff and pupils relied on her to respond calmly during sports events and school activities, and she carried that responsibility with the seriousness expected of older teens preparing to step into adulthood. Those who spent time with her describe a girl who was generous with her time and gentle in how she treated others. There are recollections of her lingering behind with teammates after practice to help clear equipment, staying to chat with younger pupils who admired her, and offering encouragement during matches whether she was on the court or standing on the sidelines. She had the kind of social ease that made younger learners gravitate toward her and peers confide in her. At home, she was a typical teenager navigating her school life, friendships, and the small uncertainties that come with being 16. But she was also warm, affectionate, and deeply connected to her family. Her mother was central to her world, the person she checked in with, the one she kept updated about her day, the one she was expected to return home to after school events. That strong parent-child relationship became tragically clear in hindsight. The moment she didn't arrive home, her mother knew something was wrong. Within the school community, Deveney's personality left its mark in small but lasting ways, the kind that live on when people speak about a learner after they are gone. Teachers remembered her respectfulness, her willingness to participate, her sense of responsibility. Friends remembered her warmth, her humor, and the kind of enthusiasm that made other teens feel safe in her company. These individual memories, scattered across classrooms and sports fields, formed the picture of a girl who was building her life slowly, gentle, and with the kind of promise that makes tragedy even harder to comprehend. In the weeks following her death, the stories that emerged about her were not exaggerated tributes born from grief, but consistent reflections from those who knew her. Everything described pointed toward a teenager who was still discovering herself but had already found ways to bring light into the spaces she moved through. She was, in every sense, a child of her community, part of its routine, its laughter, its everyday life. Understanding who Deveney was is essential because it anchors this case not in the violence that ended her life, but in the person whose life deserved to continue. Before the investigation, before the court appearances, before the public outrage, she was a young girl who had done nothing more than show up at school, fulfill her duties, and prepare to go home. The story that follows begins with her, a teenager whose future was unfolding in ordinary, hopeful ways until it was taken from her. Thursday, 7 August 2024 began like any other school day at Overberg High. Learners moved through the morning's lessons with the familiar rhythm of winter term, books under their arms, jokes in the corridors, the low murmur of teachers trying to keep a restless teenage energy focused on the board. For Deveney, the day followed its usual pattern. She attended her classes, met up with friends between periods, and looked ahead to the afternoon sports activities that kept the campus busy long after the final bell. By mid-afternoon, the school grounds had taken on that distinctive energy that comes with extramural time. Netball courts echoed with the thud of balls and the sharp calls of referees. Spectators lingered at the edges of the fields. Pupils moved between the changing rooms, the stands, and the tuck shop. It was in this environment, noisy, open, familiar, that Deveney took up a role in the school's first A team, positioned near the netball courts where she was on standby in case any of the players were injured. At around 3:45, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, she was seen near those courts. The sports program was beginning to wind down, and pupils were drifting into the transitional phase between activity and departure. Some were packing up equipment, others were heading toward the parking area, and a few remained on the sidelines tying up loose ends before heading home. Among them was a young boy she knew from school, someone she would have encountered often in that context. He spoke to her there, near the court, and asked her to walk with him. There was nothing unusual about the interaction. Learners stepped aside to chat all the time. The two of them moved away from the court and towards one of the outbuildings on the property, a storeroom used for equipment, standing a little apart from the main flow of movement, close enough to reach in a minute or two, but quiet enough that few people passed it without a reason. They went inside, and from that moment, Deveney disappeared from everyone else's view. Outside, the rest of the afternoon continued undisturbed. Netball fixtures wrapped up, players and coaches gathered belongings. Cars began to pull out of the school parking lot, their headlights cutting through the early evening light. Staff finished supervising duties and prepared to leave. For those still around, there was nothing to distinguish that day from any other Thursday at a busy high school. No one knew that, behind the closed door of a storeroom on campus, one of the learners had been violently attacked and killed. It was only once Deveney failed to arrive home that the first sign of something being wrong appeared. Her family expected her back in Caledon after her day at school. When she did not show up, concern quickly turned into alarm. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Messages were left without response. Her mother reported her missing, and in a small community where people know each other's routines, the situation escalated rapidly. As the evening set in, word spread that a learner from Overberg High had not returned home. Parents began phoning one another, checking whether anyone had seen her leave the school or board transport. Learners exchanged frantic messages, replaying the afternoon in their minds, when they'd last seen her, where she had been standing, whether they'd noticed anything unusual. The kind of fear that usually belongs to crime reports in distant cities had arrived at their doorstep. Soon, people began to organize themselves into search efforts. Some retraced the roads between Caledon and Caledon. Others focused on the school and its surroundings, sweeping the grounds, checking corners, walking along the perimeter fences and nearby streets. Torches lit up patches of darkness. Names were called into the night. Neighbors who barely knew the family came out to help, moved by the instinctive understanding that when a child is missing, the whole community is implicated. Those first hours were defined by uncertainty. There was still room to hope that she had been delayed, that a misunderstanding had occurred, that she might walk through the door, be found at a friend's house, or on a bus that had simply broken down. But as the night deepened without any sign of her, that hope grew thinner. The absence of answers pressed heavily on those searching, and on the family waiting for news that did not come. The following morning, the focus of the search shifted back decisively to the school grounds. Investigators and staff conducted a more methodical sweep of the campus. They moved through classrooms, checked less frequented areas, and directed attention to buildings that had not been opened during the chaotic rush of the previous night. It was during this process that they reached the storeroom, the same building she had entered the afternoon before and never left. When the door was opened, the worst fears were confirmed. Inside that storeroom, they found Deveney's body. In that instance, the nature of the situation changed completely. There was no longer a missing person to locate, no possibility that she might still appear alive somewhere else. The search was over. A crime scene had taken its place. The storeroom, once just a dull, functional part of the school infrastructure, now held the weight of an entire town's heartbreak. News of the discovery moved quickly to Caledon and Caledon. For her family, it was the moment their world split into a before and an after. For the learners and staff at Overberg High, it was a shattering revelation. A classmate, a friend, a daughter had been killed not on a dark road or in some distant, dangerous place, but here, in the heart of the institution they trusted to keep children safe. What followed, the questions, the anger, the slow unwinding of how this could happen belongs to the investigation. But the timeline of her murder, as it unfolded in those final hours, is stark in its simplicity. A walk across a sports field on an ordinary afternoon, a closed door, a night of frantic searching, and the discovery the next day that a bright 16-year-old girl had died alone in a room no one thought to fear. When officers entered the storeroom at Overberg High on the morning of 8 August 2024 and discovered Deveney's body, the shock of the moment collided immediately with the need for precision. What lay before them was no longer a missing person inquiry, but a homicide scene frozen in time. Every mark, every object, every trace of disturbance had the potential to reveal how a teenager had been killed on school grounds without anyone noticing. Investigators moved methodically, conscious of the gravity of what they were looking at. The storeroom was sealed, photographed and examined with layers of forensic care befitting a crime of this magnitude. Her body was found inside the small building, with clear signs of a violent struggle and the blunt fact that she had been murdered in a place where she should have been safe. Officers threaded through the evidence, the position of her body, the injuries she had sustained, the disturbed objects around her, and the absence of any indication that she had been moved from another location. They already knew the attack had occurred the previous afternoon. What they needed to know now was a path, a sequence of clues that would narrow the pool of possibilities and bring some logic to the brutality of what they were seeing. The body was removed for post-mortem examination, and the scene was turned over repeatedly in an attempt to reconstruct the final minutes. Outside, officers canvassed the school grounds for anyone who had seen her after sports, anyone who had noticed unusual movement near the storeroom, and anyone who could offer insight into why she would have gone there. The school was still in shock, teachers and learners reeling from the knowledge that Deveney had been on the premises the entire time people had searched for her the previous night. What investigators discovered in those first hours became the anchor of the case. Whoever had killed her had done so shortly after she was last seen alive, at a time when learners were still milling about the courts and the attacker had left her in the storeroom without making any apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Because the school community was relatively small, the pool of potential suspects was limited to those who had been on campus around that time. That narrowed the field drastically. But the first significant break in the case came not from physical clues inside the storeroom, but from something far more revealing: behavior. In those initial hours after her disappearance, on the night of 7 August, one of the learners had been unusually involved in the search efforts. He'd walked from group to group, offering assistance, suggesting areas to check, and speaking with a confidence and composure that caught the attention of several adults. At the time, his presence had not seemed strange. When a child goes missing, community instinct often brings out the helpers. But in hindsight, the calmness he displayed during the frantic search began to feel uncomfortable. Not because calmness was suspicious in itself, but because it contrasted sharply with the panic unfolding around him. As officers revisited accounts from the night before, his behavior stood out. He'd been one of the last people to see her alive. He had participated in multiple search pockets. He'd been near the netball courts when she disappeared. And when asked later about his movements that afternoon, his story lacked the seamlessness investigators expected. There were gaps. Moments in his version of events didn't align with those of other pupils. Timelines began to buckle under scrutiny. The real turning point came when investigators began tracing her cell phone. The device was missing, taken from her after the attack. When officers examined the network data and cross-reference activity among pupils, the picture became sharper. Attention shifted decisively towards the same learner who had been so active in the search. His proximity to her at the time she vanished, coupled with inconsistencies in his explanation, placed him in a narrowing circle of suspicion. When investigators questioned him further, the facade began to crack. He offered explanations that contradicted earlier claims. His memory of certain movements blurred conveniently. As officers pressed him with details from the timeline they were reconstructing, he struggled to sustain a consistent account. And when fragments of physical evidence began to point toward him, including those relating to the items missing from the storeroom and what she'd been carrying, the investigation reached a point of no return. He was taken into custody soon thereafter. Once he was detained, investigators widened their scope, trying to understand not only what had happened inside the storeroom, but why. They dug into his behavioral history at school and discovered that staff had previously raised concerns about emotional volatility, aggression, and troubling interactions with other learners. These concerns had been flagged months earlier, and he'd been referred for a psychological assessment. That assessment was supposed to determine whether he required specialized intervention or closer monitoring. But according to information that surfaced later, the magistrate overseeing the matter had dismissed the evaluation, an error that would become a flashpoint in the public conversation about the failures that contributed to Deveney's death. This revelation sent ripples through the investigation and eventually through the justice system itself. The fact that a judicial officer had ignored an expert evaluation, one designed specifically to identify potential risks and guide decisions about a minor's conduct, added a grim layer to the tragedy. It meant that warning signs had existed long before the fatal attack, but the mechanisms intended to address them had been short-circuited. The system had not only failed to protect him, by extension, it had failed to protect those around him. As detectives pieced together his profile, more information emerged. He'd been implicated in allegations involving younger girls in Grabo months earlier. These complaints had been reported but never progressed to formal prosecution. It became apparent that he had been accused of assaulting multiple minors, allegations that at the time were still under investigation. When officers compared those earlier cases with what had happened to Deveney, they saw behavioral patterns that aligned disturbingly well. The earlier allegations, once isolated incidents, now formed part of a broader portrait of a young offender whose conduct was escalating. The investigation also moved into digital territory. Officers examined his communication history, his interactions online, and his behavioral patterns. They looked for anything that could contextualize the attack, whether there had been prior threats, whether he had expressed violent ideation, or whether he had made attempts to intimidate her or other learners. This digital tracing helped develop a full understanding of his conduct before the murder, adding depth to what they already knew from witness interviews and physical evidence. Meanwhile, the school community faced waves of anger and disbelief. Parents demanded answers about how this could have happened on school grounds, and staff struggled under the weight of both trauma and the public scrutiny that followed. For investigators, this external pressure was palpable, but it did not steer the direction of their work. They knew the case rested on firm factual grounds, and with the suspect now in custody, the forensic and psychological components of the investigation moved quickly into the prosecutorial phase. The NPA's involvement deepened as all investigative threads converged into a single narrative supported by evidence. The plea and sentencing agreement, the document that would later form the backbone of the case, detailed the attack, the intention, the concealment, and the immediate aftermath with a clarity that could withstand judicial scrutiny. The minute the suspect admitted to the sequence of events that took place inside the storeroom, the case transitioned from an unfolding investigation into a matter of sentencing and accountability. But even with the confession, the investigation remained a haunting reminder of the fragility of institutional safeguards. Detectives could reconstruct a timeline, the MPA could prosecute, the court could sentence, but the echoes of what had been missed, the psych evaluation dismissed, the earlier cases unresolved, the behavioral warnings left unattended, remained embedded in the investigative record. By the time the investigation concluded, the truth was clear. Deveney's murder was not only the result of a violent act committed by a teenager, it was also the culmination of systemic failures that allowed a troubled boy to move through environments where his escalating behavior went unchecked. The investigation had done its job. It had found the attacker, established the facts, and secured accountability. But the deeper reckoning, how the signs had been missed, how warnings had been overlooked, and how the justice system had failed to intervene when it could have, would linger long after the case file was closed. By the time investigators identified the teenage boy responsible for Deveney's murder, it became clear that this was not a case born from an isolated moment of violence. The boy who killed her was 16, still legally a minor, yet already carrying a history of conduct that should have signaled serious concern long before the events of 7 August 2024. According to case files referenced by the NPA, he'd been accused of targeting vulnerable minors in his community, luring them into secluded areas, and assaulting them. These allegations were not minor behavioral issues or ambiguous misunderstandings. They were grave criminal complaints serious enough that specialized investigators had begun examining them long before Deveney died. The pattern was unmistakable when viewed in hindsight. He selected girls younger or physically smaller than he was, isolated them, and exercised power in moments where he believed he would not be seen. Yet despite the seriousness of those allegations, none had reached the courtroom. They hovered in bureaucratic limbo, awaiting prosecutorial decisions and the slow movements of a system already stretched by high caseloads. The boy's school life had begun to reveal similar concerns. Teachers had noticed patterns that worried them: sudden bursts of anger, difficulty controlling impulses, troubling interactions with female learners, and episodes of aggression that exceeded the ordinary turbulence of adolescence. As those behaviors intensified, the school followed procedure and referred him for formal assessment. A clinical psychologist evaluated him and produced a report noting that he exhibited warning signs requiring further intervention. The details of the report have not been made public in full, but what is known is that the evaluation identified risks that warranted close monitoring and possible psychiatric or therapeutic support. The case was then brought before a magistrate who was expected to consider the findings and determine what should happen next. But that hearing never moved forward as intended. The magistrate dismissed the psychological evaluation outright. The grounds for this dismissal, now the subject of scrutiny and disciplinary inquiry, were viewed as procedurally improper. By ignoring the expert assessment, the magistrate effectively removed the only formal mechanism that could have compelled intervention. The decision meant that the red flags observed by teachers, documented by psychologists, and noted in earlier case files remained unaddressed. In the months that followed, the boy's behavior continued without meaningful oversight. Those early allegations from Caledon had not dissolved, they had simply gone nowhere. Nobody closed the file. Nobody issued a warning, and nobody ensured that he was monitored. His peers saw only fragments of his behavior, moments of volatility, tension, or possessiveness. But teenagers are conditioned to assume that other teenagers are simply going through something. Teachers are trained to notice concerning behaviors, but when a system signals that intervention is not forthcoming, schools are left in a precarious position. It was within that context that the boy arrived at school each day. He moved to classrooms, mingled among other learners, and participated in activities as though the unresolved cases behind him were not quietly accumulating weight. No one at Overberg High was aware of the full extent of his history. The allegations in Caledon were not school matters, they were police matters. The psychological evaluation had been dismissed. The school was not empowered to enforce treatment or monitoring on its own. Each institution had a portion of the picture, but none held the complete image. What the public first understood about the boy, that he was a quiet learner with no obvious social footprint, soon gave way to the truth. He was a young offender whose criminal behavior had been escalating, whose psychological state had been flagged by experts, and whose access to vulnerable minors had never been meaningfully curtailed. By the time his full history came to light, it was no longer possible to see the murder of Deveney as an isolated act. It was the culmination of a pattern. It was the final point on a line that had been drawn months earlier in Caledon, traced to the abandoned evaluation and left unbroken until it crossed paths with a girl who should have had no reason to fear him. Once the investigation had concluded and the full scope of evidence had been laid out, the case moved into the formal machinery of the criminal justice system, a process that unfolded with a speed and clarity rarely seen in matters involving minors in conflict with the law. The facts had been established with precision. The timeline had been reconstructed. The suspect's role had been confirmed through physical evidence, contradictory statements, and ultimately an admission of guilt. What remained was the legal question of how a child who had committed an act of extraordinary violence should be held accountable. Because the boy was 16 at the time of the murder, the matter fell under the Child Justice Act, which requires that minors be handled within a separate framework designed to balance accountability with rehabilitation. Even so, the gravity of the crime placed him at the highest tier of that system, the category reserved for the most serious offenses committed by children. This meant that although he would not be tried as an adult, he would still face the harshest sentence available for a minor. Before the case could proceed to trial, his legal team entered into discussions with the NPA. The strength of the evidence, combined with the detailed investigative record and the impossibility of disputing the forensic and circumstantial findings, led to a plea and sentence agreement, a structured admission of guilt that laid out, in exact terms, what happened on the afternoon of 7 August 2024. Through this agreement, he confirmed the sequence of events, leading Deveney to the storeroom, assaulting her, throttling her, stabbing her multiple times, leaving her body inside the building, taking her cell phone, and returning to school activities as though nothing had occurred. The plea agreement served two purposes. First, it established a factual basis that complied with the evidentiary requirements of the court. Second, it allowed the judge to impose a sentence without a lengthy trial, sparing Deveney's family and community an emotionally punishing legal process. The court accepted the plea on the basis that the facts were consistent with the investigative findings and that the details provided reflected an intentional killing carried out without provocation, coercion, or external influences. What remained was sentencing, the point at which the court had to determine the appropriate consequence for a crime that had horrified an entire community. Even under the Child Justice Act, courts retain wide discretion to impose severe measures when the offense is murder, especially when it is premeditated or accompanied by extreme violence. The judge hearing the matter acknowledged the boy's age, his legal status as a minor, and the statutory objectives of juvenile sentencing, but the court also considered the brutality of the attack, the vulnerability of the victim, and the profound impact on her family and school community. After weighing several key considerations, the judge delivered the maximum sentence legally possible for a minor under the Child Justice Act, a decade-long period of compulsory residence in a secure youth facility. This sentence is the statutory equivalent of imprisonment for a minor, a custodial measure involving structural rehabilitation programs, restricted movement, and extended institutional oversight. It ensures that he will not return to the community until adulthood, and even then, only under controlled re-entry conditions. The court's reasoning was grounded in two principles. First, the seriousness of the crime. The murder was deliberate, violent, and committed against a vulnerable teenager who had no ability to defend herself. Second, the need to protect the public, particularly other minors, from a boy whose behavioral pattern had escalated in ways that posed clear danger. The judge was unequivocal in stating that the nature of the offense warranted the most severe sanction available. For Deveney's family, the sentence was a complex outcome. The fact that the boy was a minor meant that he could not receive the same punishment an adult would have faced for murder, but the finality of the plea, the detailed admission of guilt, and the maximum allowable sentence provided a measure of closure. Her mother, who had endured the anguish of searching for her daughter and then learning how violently she had died, was spared of the distress of a drawn-out trial. The community too found a form of resolution, not in the sense of healing, but in the knowledge that the truth had been established and the perpetrator held accountable. In Grappo and Caledon, where grief had mixed with outrage, the conviction clarified the narrative that had unsettled residents for months. It confirmed that the danger had come from within the school, that the boy had been responsible, and that he would not return to the community for many years. Yet even in the clarity of the conviction, the case remained shadowed by the failures that had preceded it. What the conviction provided was a boundary, a factual judicial endpoint to the question of who killed Deveney and how the case concluded legally. It did not answer why the danger went uncontained, nor how the earlier warnings had been ignored. It simply closes the criminal narrative that began the moment investigators entered the storeroom. The boy confessed. The court accepted the plea. The sentence was imposed. The case from a legal standpoint was concluded. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our podcast and follow our sister show, Unsolved Murders SA, where we explore South Africa's most haunting cold cases. Please remember, the views and opinions shared in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Sister Post, its parent company, Our Wisherwood Publications, or its partners. Some of the content featured in the series describes details of extreme violence. We urge our listeners to practice discretion and to prioritize their well-being while engaging with our content. Until the next episode, stay safe, stay aware, and thank you for helping us keep these stories alive.